7 days, Adrian Costello said, sliding the contract across the table, his voice calm. Too calm for a proposition that could ruin or save a life. 7 days, Mira. You'll be my wife. My perfect wife. Just long enough for my family to believe it. And in return, his dark eyes locked onto mine, sharp as a blade wrapped in velvet. In return, I'll give you something no one has ever given you. A way out. I should have walked away. I should have refused the deal that smelled of danger, secrets, and a man who didn't know how to ask, only how to command. But desperation has a way of sounding like destiny. And somehow, without signing anything yet, I already felt the cage closing and the door unlocking at the same time. If this opening pulled you in, subscribe for more stories and drop a 1 good or 0 bad to let me know what you think. Christmas Eve has a strange way of exposing the truth about people. For some, it brings out joy. For others, generosity. But for Mira Lane, it revealed just how close a person can stand at the edge without realizing they've already stepped past it. La Mirabella, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, was drowning in gold light and holiday charm. The kind of place that made ordinary people feel poor even before seeing the bill. Crystal glasses lined tables draped in white linen. Snowflake lights shimmered from the ceiling, and the quiet hum of luxury hovered in every corner of the room. But none of that beauty reached Mira. She moved through the aisles like a shadow. Her black apron cinched too tightly because she'd lost weight again. Another side effect of choosing bills over groceries. She had slept maybe 4 hours total in the last 3 nights, and the dark circles beneath her eyes were barely concealed under cheap concealer. Her shoes dug into her heels, worn down from double shifts, triple shifts, whatever she could grab to keep herself afloat. Christmas Eve was supposed to save her. One night of generous tippers. One night where wealthy customers scattered money the way they scattered laughter. One night that could buy her 30 more days before the landlord knocked again. But survival has a way of demanding payment from those who are already empty. Mira's hands trembled every time she lifted a tray. Not because of nerves, she'd gotten used to being invisible, but because exhaustion had burrowed so deeply into her bones, she wasn't sure she remembered what real rest felt like. Her father's medical debt, 3 months of unpaid rent, the rising cost of her medication for insomnia and anxiety. Every step she took, she carried all of it with her, like a weight she couldn't put down. And then there was table 9, the table everyone whispered about, the table no one wanted to serve, the table blocked off with velvet ropes and guarded by men who didn't smile. VIP Table 9. Mira didn't usually pay attention to the restaurant gossip, but even she knew enough to understand what it meant when the manager straightened his jacket 5 times before opening the door for a particular guest. What it meant when the kitchen went silent as someone passed by. What it meant when customers instinctively lowered their voices once the reservation holder arrived. Because Table 9 belonged to Adrian Costello. To most people, that name floated somewhere between myth and threat. The heir to the Costello Empire, financial titans with old money, old enemies, and even older secrets. No one knew the full truth behind the family, but everyone knew better than to get in their way. Adrian was the kind of man who commanded without speaking, the kind who didn't need to raise his voice to make a room obey him, the kind whose presence made even the wealthy stiffen in their chairs. And he was here, on Mira's shift. She noticed him before anyone told her. It was impossible not to. There was something unnervingly quiet about him. A composure that didn't match the chaos of Christmas Eve. He sat with one elbow on the table, a glass at his side he didn't touch. His dark suit fit his frame with expert precision. His eyes were sharp and steady, like a man who saw everything and revealed nothing. When he looked at Mira, it wasn't casual, it wasn't curious. It was as if he were reading her like a case file, evaluating, measuring, decoding. She didn't like the way her stomach tightened under that gaze. She didn't like how seen she suddenly felt. She didn't like the way her breath hitched for reasons she didn't understand. People like him lived in a world far above hers. People like him had power she couldn't imagine. People like him didn't look at waitresses unless they wanted something. But there was no time to analyze his attention. Not when she still had a job to do. Mira steadied her hands on the edge of the counter as the pastry chef slid a tray of Christmas Eve desserts toward her. Elegant towers of chocolate, cream, and gold dust. $200 worth of fragile perfection balanced on a single silver tray. If she could deliver this without disaster, she might make enough in tips to pay for her overdue medication. Maybe even buy groceries that didn't come from the clearance shelf. Maybe. Her thoughts were cut short by a sound she didn't hear but felt, the tiny scrape of the rug beneath her shoe. The moment stretched like slow motion. The tray tilted. Her heart lunged into her throat, and gravity claimed everything. Desserts crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces that glittered under the chandelier. Chocolate splattered across the marble tiles, streaking in chaotic patterns, and splashed across the immaculate charcoal fabric of Adrian Costello's suit. The entire restaurant froze. Chairs didn't move. Conversations didn't resume. Even the violin seemed to pause mid-note. Mira didn't breathe. She couldn't. And then there was the shift, the invisible ripple of danger that came whenever men like Adrian were crossed. Two guards stepped forward instantly, hands sliding into their jackets with practiced precision. Everyone knew what that meant. Everyone knew exactly why Mira's blood went cold in her veins. She dropped to her knees before thought could catch up. Apologies tumbled from her lips in broken, frantic fragments. Her hands scrambled toward the broken glass, but her fingers were trembling so violently she only managed to cut her palm on the sharpest shard. Blood welled immediately, warm and terrifying. She didn't notice the pain. She didn't feel the sting. She only felt shame and fear, and the crushing realization that she had just ruined the one night she desperately needed to get right. Her shoulders curled inward, her breath coming in shaky bursts as she tried to clean the mess. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not now, not in front of this man. But Adrian Costello had already moved. His hand closed around her wrist, not harshly, not gently, but with a certainty that stole her breath. He lifted her from the floor effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing. The guards froze mid-step, halted by nothing more than a flash of his eyes. He dismissed them with a small gesture. They obeyed instantly. The restaurant held its breath. Mira did too. Her palm dripped blood onto the pristine tablecloth as she stood before him. She felt small, breakable, painfully exposed. His attention pinned her in place like a blade. Sharp, cold, unnervingly focused. And then, with a calm that didn't match the tension around them, Adrian reached into his suit jacket. Her mind raced with 1,000 terrible possibilities. But what he withdrew wasn't a threat. It was a simple card, off-white, minimalist, embossed with nothing but an address carved in ink so subtle it seemed to glow under the candlelight. No name, no number, just a destination. He placed it into her trembling hand and closed her fingers around it, his touch warm against her cold skin. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Not a minute late. The instructions weren't spoken loudly, but they cut through the silence with absolute clarity. No explanation, no context, just a command from a man used to being obeyed. He stood, signaling his men without looking at them, and walked away with such controlled precision that the room parted for him like water. When the doors closed behind him, the spell finally broke. Voices rose. The violinist resumed playing. Customers whispered with a mixture of fascination and unease. But Mira didn't hear any of it. She stared at the card in her hand, her blood smudged across the edges, her breathing unsteady. The room felt too bright, too loud, too suffocating. Her mind spun with fear she couldn't name and curiosity she wished she didn't have. She knew this wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. The kind you didn't ignore, the kind that came with consequences, the kind that could unravel the thin thread her life was clinging to. She should throw it away. She should walk home and pretend none of this ever happened. She should run as far from this man and his world as possible. But the truth was brutally simple. She couldn't afford to run, not from danger, not from debt, not from fate. And as she tucked the card into her apron, Mira Lane felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A shift, a beginning, a door cracking open to a world she wasn't prepared for. She didn't know yet what waited behind that address, but she feared it, she needed it, and she would walk through it anyway. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in life is having nothing left to lose. Thon Bai. There are neighborhoods in the city where time feels different, slower, colder, heavier. Places where money isn't just wealth, but legacy, intimidation, and history stitched into every brick. Lexington Row was one of those places, a street where every house looked like it had a secret, and every secret had a price. Mira Lane felt that weight the moment she stepped out of the cab. She didn't belong among the manicured hedges or the polished brownstones that gleamed like glass in the winter sun. Cars glided silently along the curb, sleek black sedans, machines built more for power than comfort. Even the air felt thicker, as if the neighborhood itself knew she wasn't one of its own. She clutched the off-white card Adrian Costello had given her, its edges still faintly stained with her blood from the night before. For hours she had thought about throwing it away. For hours she had told herself that nothing good came from a man who carried danger the way others carried cologne. But desperation was stronger than fear, strong enough to drag her up the stone stairway toward the glossy black door of number 17. She didn't get the chance to knock. The lock clicked on its own, and the door cracked open just enough for a large figure to fill the space. A man built like a wall stepped forward, expression unreadable, shoulders stretching the seams of his tailored suit. A thin earpiece curled behind his neck. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what she wanted. He only looked into her eyes for one long, assessing moment, as if comparing her face to an image already stored in some internal database, before stepping aside. And just like that, Mira was inside. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of a home, but the heavy, controlled stillness of a place where mistakes had consequences. The hallway was immaculate, exposed brick, dark wood floors polished to mirror shine, art pieces arranged like exhibits in a private gallery. Everything felt intentional, curated, cold. This wasn't the house of a man who lived. It was the house of a man who observed. The guard led her deeper into the brownstone without saying a word. Cameras blinked in the corners, subtle but unmistakable. She wondered how many more watched her, how many had already identified her, tracked her, cataloged her presence before she even rang the doorbell. Every step made her feel smaller, and then she reached the second floor. The room was large, too large to be called a living room, too curated to be a workspace. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the frozen skyline beyond. Soft winter light slid over dark leather furniture and sharp lines. Everything smelled faintly of cedar, citrus, and something colder beneath it. Something controlled. Mira instantly knew she was not alone. Adrian Costello stood with his back to her, one hand in his pocket, the other resting casually near the frame of the window. Even from behind, he radiated control. The kind of presence that didn't need to fill space. It bent space around it. He didn't turn when she entered. He didn't greet her. He simply existed, and her breath tightened. It struck her then. She was standing in the home of a man whose last name made entire boardrooms quiet. A man whose family had built empires across finance, politics, and the darker corners in between. A man who didn't need to offer explanations because the world rarely demanded them from him. When he finally turned, it wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. Like he was allowing the moment to unfold exactly as he intended. His eyes found hers immediately. Not curious, not surprised, just knowing. Mira felt every layer of her defenses fall apart again, the way they had the night before when she spilled desserts onto his suit. But today was different. Today she couldn't run away. She wasn't sure she wanted to. Adrian observed her silently, the faintest shift in his expression betraying that he'd noticed the exhaustion she tried and failed to hide. She had brushed her hair, borrowed a decent coat, tried to present herself as someone less breakable, but standing in that immaculate room, she felt every crack. And then he spoke, not as apology, not as threat, but as a simple statement of fact. His family was calling a council of heirs in 7 days, an old tradition where the patriarch evaluated every potential successor. Their wealth didn't come from restaurants or retail. The Costellos lived in a world of offshore vaults, shadow investments, and power that didn't appear on paper. They were a financial dynasty with ties stronger than the law, older than morality, and their traditions were ironclad. Every heir had to prove stability, partnership, legacy, meaning, a wife. The women the Costellos tried to push toward Adrian saw only his empire, his suits, his inheritance. They didn't care if he was lonely. They didn't notice that his silence was a shield. They didn't see the man, only the throne. But Mira, she had looked at him last night like he was a person, not a prize. And that was the thing he trusted least, the thing he needed most. Adrian spoke about the council not with irritation, but with a calm that held something colder beneath it, a lifetime of responsibility, expectation, and threat woven together. He wasn't afraid of his family, but he understood them with a precision that bordered on survival instinct. Then he told her what he needed, not affection, not romance, not loyalty, a wife, a perfect, believable wife for 7 days, long enough for the council to pass, short enough to end before anyone asked questions. He didn't sugarcoat the danger. He didn't hide the truth. The Costello family valued loyalty above all else, but their definition of loyalty was warped by decades of power, greed, and family politics. To survive among them required instinct, intelligence, and someone willing to obey the rules that protected her. Mira listened. She tried to keep her face steady, but her heart thudded in her chest. She didn't understand why he chose her. She wasn't polished, she wasn't wealthy, she wasn't trained for deception, but maybe that was the point. Because when she looked up, she realized Adrian Costello wasn't searching for beauty or status or perfection. He was searching for someone real, someone who wasn't there to climb his empire, someone who didn't flinch at power, but didn't chase it either. She wondered if he saw the fear in her eyes. She wondered if he saw the part of her that longed for escape, even if the escape was dangerous. And then she understood the truth. Adrian wasn't offering her a role. He was offering her a lifeline. 1 week of pretending, 1 week of stepping into a world where danger wore tailored suits, 1 week that could pay off her debts, her rent, her medication, maybe even buy her a future. But 1 week that could also swallow her whole. When he finished explaining the terms, the silence between them shifted. Not hostile, not soft, just weighted with possibilities. Mira felt something tighten in her chest, a thread pulling her forward and warning her away in the same breath. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Adrian already knew her answer. Because women like Mira Lane don't walk into houses like this unless they've already been pushed to the edge. Unless this offer, this impossible, dangerous, intoxicating offer, was the only door still open. And standing there, staring at the heir of the Castello Empire, she realized something chillingly simple. Her life was about to change, not because she wanted it to, but because this man had decided she was the piece he needed in his game. And whether she survived the next 7 days was a question neither of them dared to say aloud. When people talk about life-changing moments, they often imagine something cinematic, an epiphany, a dramatic revelation, a fateful coincidence. But sometimes life changes in the quietest room, under the soft glow of afternoon light. With nothing more than a stack of paper laid neatly across a glass table. That was what Mira Lane faced as she sat in Adrian Costello's private study. The room itself felt like an indictment. Sleek surfaces, sharp edges, shadows arranged with surgical precision. Everything about it was designed to remind visitors that the man who owned this place didn't think in half measures. He didn't negotiate, he calculated. And now Mira was sitting across from him, staring at what might have been the most dangerous document she had ever seen. The contract wasn't long, not by legal standards, but every line burned with consequences she didn't yet understand. The weight of each clause pressed down on her chest as she scanned the pages. 7 days, 7 nights, 7 opportunities to make a mistake that she might never recover from. Yet she read every word, because Adrian demanded that much. He wanted no surprises, no misunderstandings, and certainly no excuses. The first requirement was the simplest and somehow the hardest. She was to play the role of a devoted wife, not just in name, not just on paper, but convincingly. Convincingly enough to deceive a family built on suspicion and power. A family where lies weren't weaknesses, they were weapons. She had to learn a love story that had never happened. According to the script, she and Adrian had met 3 months earlier at a high-profile auction in Manhattan. She had been working there as a server, close enough to her real life to seem believable, and a drunken guest had cornered her. In the fabricated story, Adrian had intervened, setting off a whirlwind romance that culminated in a quiet, private wedding. A fairy tale. The kind of story rich families adored. The kind of story no one questioned, if performed flawlessly. But the details mattered. Where they supposedly shared their first kiss. What they ate at their anniversary dinner. An anniversary that didn't exist. The small habits couples knew about each other. The little things that screamed authenticity far more than grand gestures ever could. If Mira forgot even one detail, someone in the Castello family would notice. Then came the living arrangements. The 7th page of the contract spelled it out in firm, unemotional language. She and Adrian would share a room, one space. A married couple couldn't be seen sleeping separately. Not in a family that valued unity as much as dominance. There would be 2 beds. Fine. No one needed to know that. But she would live in his space, follow his routines, appear at his side. Every morning, every night. The next section twisted her stomach even tighter. Wardrobe. Adrian would choose every outfit, dresses tailored to fit her, jewelry selected with purpose, coats and heels she could never afford. Not for vanity, but for strategy. In his world, appearances weren't optional. They were currency, and she had none of her own. She had to become the image of a Castello wife, someone who looked untouchable, someone who belonged to him. The obligations continued. She was required to remain physically close during family gatherings, never more than 2 steps away. A man like Adrian didn't move without intention, and neither could she. Every gesture had to convey harmony, unity, and possession. She wasn't just playing a part. She was becoming an extension of him. And then she reached rule number 1. The letters seemed to thicken as she read the lines. No being alone, no closed-door conversations, no unsupervised interactions with any male member of the Castello family. especially Luca Costello, Adrian's younger brother. Her chest tightened as she read the footnote. Luca's past wasn't written out completely, but the lines hinted at scandals, the kind that involve young women, the kind swept under rugs woven with power, intimidation, and silence. Names omitted, settlements paid, stories buried. Rule number one wasn't paranoia. It was protection, and not from outsiders, from insiders. Adrian waited silently as she read, his posture controlled, his eyes steady. He didn't pace, didn't fidget, didn't break the tension with unnecessary explanations. He simply watched her absorb the magnitude of what she was signing up for. Because in his world, this wasn't just a contract, it was a shield, a warning, a vow wrapped in legal language. When she reached the final page, her hands trembled again, not from fear alone, from the realization that she stood at the threshold of a life completely opposite to her own. The signature line looked like a small thing, thin, delicate, almost unimportant, but she knew the moment her pen touched it, she would no longer be Mira Lane, the girl struggling to afford rent and medication. She would become Mira Costello, Adrian's wife, his temporary wife, yes, but in the Costello household, even temporary things carried permanent risks. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The pen felt too heavy. Her pulse thumped violently in her ears. Every instinct begged her to stand up, run out, and never look back. But instincts didn't pay rent. Instincts didn't erase debt. Instincts didn't keep the landlord from knocking tomorrow morning. She signed, and the sound of that pen scraping across the paper felt like a door closing behind her. Adrian didn't hesitate. He took the pen, signed his own name in bold, deliberate strokes. There was no tremor in his hand, no pause before committing. He wasn't entering a new world. He was reinforcing one he already ruled. When he finished, he slid the contract back into its folder with the calm finality of a man sealing a fate. Only then did he speak. There was no triumph in his voice, no satisfaction, only iron certainty, as if this was the outcome he always expected. In that moment, the world seemed to shift, the air tightening around them. Mira felt it, not as romance, not as fear, but as gravity. The kind of gravity that only comes from standing too close to someone who has the power to both save and destroy. The room was silent. The city hummed beyond the windows. Snow drifted down like falling ash. Mira Lane had walked into this house as a stranger, a waitress, a girl barely holding her life together. She walked out of that room as Mira Costello, wife to a man whose name could open doors or lock them forever. A woman who now belonged to a world where every smile hid an agenda and every shadow hid a threat. And the most frightening part wasn't the danger ahead. It was the faint, undeniable spark in her chest. The part of her that wondered whether Adrian Costello was her biggest mistake or the first person who ever truly saw her. Some journeys don't begin with a suitcase or a packed trunk. Some begin with a single moment, quiet, charged, irrevocable, when one life brushes too close to another and the world shifts before either person is ready. Mira Lane felt that shift the moment the black Mercedes pulled up to the curb in front of Adrian Costello's brownstone. Its tinted windows reflected the winter sky like obsidian glass, flawless and cold. She hesitated on the sidewalk, clutching the straps of her worn purse, wondering for the 100th time whether she had made a mistake so big she wouldn't survive it. But the door opened before she could step away. A man she recognized from the night before, broad-shouldered, built like a fortress, stood there, his hand guiding her into the back seat without a word. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something clean, expensive, almost sterile. Like power had its own scent. Inside, Adrian waited. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or checking emails. He wasn't distracted or impatient. He simply sat there, composed as if the car itself bowed to his presence. Winter sunlight traced the sharp angles of his face, making him look carved, handsome in a dangerous, untouchable way. For a moment, Mira forgot how to breathe. The car door thudded shut behind her, sealing her inside his world. A world with rules she didn't understand yet, and consequences she didn't dare imagine. The vehicle began moving before she even fastened her seatbelt. She kept her eyes forward, afraid to meet his gaze, afraid of what he might see if he looked too closely. But the silence didn't last long, not with Adrian. Silence around him wasn't emptiness. It was calculation, and he chose the moment he wanted to break it. He reached into the leather bag beside him, withdrawing a small velvet box. Soft black, understated, but unmistakably expensive. Mira's pulse faltered. It was the kind of box women dreamed about opening, but in her hands it felt too heavy, too dangerous. Adrian didn't explain. He didn't need to. He opened the box himself, revealing a ring that caught the light and fractured it into shards of brilliance. The diamond wasn't oversized or gaudy. It was classic, elegant, timeless the way old families like to pretend their values were. He took her hand without hesitation. And in that moment, Mira realized he wasn't putting on a show. There was no audience in the car, no family watching, no guards nearby. This gesture, this deeply intimate, symbolic gesture, was for no one but her. His fingers slid the ring onto hers, and the metal felt impossibly cold at first, then warm, then terrifying. Because this wasn't a costume piece. This wasn't a prop. This was a Castello heirloom. He told her in his steady, controlled voice that it had belonged to his grandmother, Lucia Castello, the only woman in the family's history who had dared to challenge the patriarch and actually won. A woman who was rumored to have stood up in a council meeting of powerful men, slammed her hand on the table and demanded respect they had refused to grant. A woman whose ring Mira now wore. The weight of it pressed on her chest more than her finger. She whispered that it was too much, that she couldn't accept something so valuable, so sacred to his family. But Adrian simply leaned back, his expression unreadable, and said nothing more. His silence wasn't dismissive, it was decisive. The decision had already been made. The ring stayed. As the Mercedes glided onto the highway, leaving the cityscape behind, Adrian removed a folder from the passenger seat. Thick, heavy, edges crisp from lack of use. He handed it to her, and she felt as if she were accepting the script to a film she didn't audition for. But this wasn't fiction. This wasn't a story she could flub or improvise. This was survival. Inside the folder were photographs, beautifully staged, convincingly candid, a shot of her and Adrian at a charity gala, laughing at something out of frame, a picture of an engagement ring on her hand, her face stunned, his expression softened just enough to look believable. A wedding portrait, just the two of them in front of a courthouse, rings visible, his hand resting on her waist with proprietary confidence. There were itineraries, receipts, even a copy of a fake honeymoon itinerary in Italy. Each detail crafted with the kind of precision that only dangerous families demanded. Adrian explained, without embellishment, that the Castello Council would dissect everything. They would question their story, analyze inconsistencies, watch their interactions for cracks. One slip, one wrong answer, one hesitation, and the whole illusion would crumble. The consequences weren't spelled out, but Mira didn't need them to be. She had witnessed enough fear in Adrian's eyes, not for himself, but for what would happen if she made a mistake. She flipped through the folder, her hands trembling as the landscape outside the car shifted from urban gray to wintry countryside. 7 hours of driving, 7 hours of memorizing a life she had never lived. 7 hours to transform herself from a waitress drowning in debt into a woman who looked like she belonged to a dynasty. But when she reached the end of the folder, the last page wasn't about the fake story. It was blank. Adrian told her the blank page was for one purpose: authenticity. If someone asked her something personal, something that couldn't be rehearsed, something spontaneous, she needed real emotions behind her answers, real memories, real history. And so, for the first time since she entered his world, he asked about hers. It started simple: her childhood, the neighborhood she grew up in, the scent of her mother's perfume before the woman walked out and never came back. Then it deepened. Long nights at the hospital, her father's hands going cold in hers. How she sold their furniture one piece at a time to pay for treatments that still failed to save him. The eviction notice taped to her door the week after the funeral. The night she spent in her car, shivering beneath blankets that smelled like grief and gasoline. The job she took at La Mirabella because it was the only place that hired without asking too many questions. By the time she finished speaking, her voice wasn't steady anymore. Not because she was ashamed, but because saying it aloud made it real again. His silence stretched across the space between them, but not cold, not judgmental, heavy, sympathetic in a way she didn't expect from a man so controlled. And when he finally spoke, his words landed with the weight of a vow. For 7 days she belonged to him, and for those 7 days, nothing and no one would harm her. He would make sure of it. It wasn't romance, it wasn't tenderness, it was protection, raw, territorial, unmistakably mafia in nature. And yet it softened something inside her. The car rolled deeper into the countryside. Snow thickened, turning the world white. As dust settled, the Mercedes turned down a private road, long, winding, lined with stone lanterns, glowing like embers in the growing dark. Mira pressed a hand to the window as the Costello estate came into view. It wasn't a house. It wasn't even a mansion. It was a kingdom. 5 wings of stone stretched outward like arms of an ancient fortress, connected by arched corridors lit from within. Massive pillars supported balconies draped in evergreen garlands. Statues of lions, cold, predatory, unblinking, stood guard at the entrance. The windows glowed with warm light, but beneath that warmth lingered something sharp, something dangerous. This wasn't a home. It was a battlefield carved in marble. People moved across the grounds dressed in winter coats far too expensive to be practical. Laughter carried on the wind, elegant, effortless, hiding tension beneath every note. The Costello family had gathered, a dynasty of power, pride, and secrets waiting inside. Mira's heartbeat drummed faster as the vehicle approached the front steps. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but the ring on her finger tightened like a promise, anchoring her to the reality she could no longer escape. Adrian's hand brushed lightly, barely against her arm. A silent signal that the performance began the moment the car door opened. And as the door swung outward, spilling warm golden light into the cold dusk, Mira Lane drew a breath she prayed would steady her. Because she wasn't stepping into a home. She was stepping into the lion's den, where every smile was a test, every gesture a signal, every shadow a warning. The Costello estate awaited, and so did her fate. There are houses that hold memories, and then there are houses that hold power. The Costello estate was the second kind, and on Mira Lane's first morning inside it, she understood immediately why Adrian had warned her. Every corridor felt like it had eyes. Every portrait seemed to judge. Every cold marble floor whispered of footsteps belonging to people who never had to fear consequences. But she wasn't one of them. Not yet. Not ever, maybe. The sun was barely rising when the first test began. Women in tailored winter coats drifted through the foyer like swans. Too composed, too polished, too rehearsed. Their diamonds glinted like armor. Their smiles were thin, precise and sharp enough to cut. And among them, standing with a glass of morning espresso, was Serena Costello. Serena wasn't like the others. She didn't smile, didn't flutter her lashes, didn't pretend warmth she didn't feel. Her beauty was sharper, intelligent eyes, perfectly controlled posture, a mind that looked like it was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. She watched Mira the way an analyst studies a puzzle. No hatred, no jealousy, just curiosity sharpened into suspicion. Serena's gaze swept from Mira's hair to the ring on her hand, to the way she stood slightly behind Adrian, unsure where safety ended and danger began. Serena noticed everything. Mira could feel it in her bones. But instead of confronting her or whispering behind her back, Serena simply nodded once. A silent acknowledgement, a silent warning. Mira wasn't sure which. Breakfast with the family wasn't breakfast at all. It was an assessment disguised as a meal. Dozens of relatives filled the long dining hall, uncles with mafia smiles, aunts with political agendas, cousins who wore arrogance as comfortably as designer coats. Their glances came at her like tiny needles, testing the softness of the newcomer, wondering if she would break. Mira tried to steady her breath, but it was impossible not to feel the weight of it all. The gold-framed windows, the gleaming silverware, the unspoken hierarchy running under every polite greeting. She clung to the script Adrian made her memorize, praying nothing in her face would give her away. Then the room shifted. People straightened in their chairs. Conversation quieted. A ripple of awareness moved down the table. Don Silvio Costello had entered, the grandfather, the patriarch, a living legend in the Costello Empire. He was older, but there was nothing fragile about him. His presence filled the room the way storms fill a horizon. Slow, powerful, announcing themselves without a word. Men twice his size lowered their eyes when he passed. Even Serena drifted back slightly, giving him space. Mira felt her pulse hammer. This was the man whose approval Adrian needed. This was the man judging her first. He took his seat at the head of the table, fingers tapping once against the mahogany surface, a sound that silenced everything else. His gaze roamed over the family, then stopped on her. It didn't soften. It didn't warm. It simply studied. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the gravel of a life lived without compromise. Mira felt the weight of his words long before she understood them. He was assessing her demeanor, her place beside Adrian, her posture, her courage. A single sentence from him could have destroyed her role in seconds. She should have kept quiet. She should have stayed invisible. She should have nodded politely and said nothing at all. But fear does strange things to honesty. When Don Silvio commented on Adrian's choice of wife, Mira's nerves betrayed her. Words slipped out before she could stop them. Soft, accidental, painfully truthful. She said Adrian wasn't difficult to understand, that beneath the composure, he looked lonely, even surrounded by people. The room went perfectly still. Forks hung in midair. Serena's eyebrow lifted slightly, and Adrian froze. Not obviously, not dramatically, just enough that Mira saw something flicker across his expression. Something raw, something surprised, something dangerously close to emotion. She had named the wound he never let anyone see. Don Silvio leaned back, eyes narrowing, studying her anew. Not as an intruder, not as a threat, but as a curiosity worth exploring. For the first time since she entered the estate, his silence wasn't disapproval. It was interest. And interest from a man like him carried more power than praise. Mira didn't understand the weight of what she had said, not fully, but Adrian did. She could feel him watching her with a new tension, part shock, part recognition. She had stepped too close, too fast into a place no one was allowed. His guard rose immediately. He guided her out of the hall the moment breakfast ended, not harshly, but with a firm hand at her back. Protective, controlled, almost tense. The eyes of the family followed them all the way down the corridor. And that was when reality changed again. He stopped at a set of double doors on the second floor, opened them, and revealed a bedroom so large it felt like a private suite inside a luxury hotel. 2 beds, heavy curtains, a balcony overlooking the eastern gardens. The kind of room meant for a couple with status, not a fake arrangement built on desperation. It would be their room, their shared space, their stage for the next 7 days. Mira's chest tightened as she stepped inside. Everything felt too soft, too expensive, too unreal. The idea of sharing a room with Adrian, even with 2 beds, felt like stepping into a fire she wasn't ready for. But the moment she turned toward him, she realized the fire wasn't the only danger. His eyes were serious, focused, sharper than they had ever been. The rules weren't spoken angrily. They weren't barked like orders. They came out low, steady, edged with something unmistakable. Fear, not of her, not of failure, of the house around them. She could never open the door without him or Serena. She could never wander alone, not even for a moment. She could never trust the walls, the smiles, the family members who asked too many friendly questions. Because this house wasn't built for safety. It was built for dominance. And Mira Lane, waitress, orphan, outsider, was stepping into the center of a family that protected its power with teeth. Adrian's final warning wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was honest in a way that made Mira's spine prickle. The Costello house was not safe. Not for her. Not for anyone unprepared. She was inside the lion's den now, and the lions had started to take notice. There are moments in life when a person looks into the mirror and no longer recognizes the reflection staring back. For Mira Lane, that moment happened a few hours after stepping into the Costello estate. It began with knocks on the bedroom door, sharp, synchronized, almost military. Before she could answer, 2 women swept inside. They wore black, moved fast, and carried cases of makeup and garment bags that shimmered with wealth she couldn't name. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't explain their purpose. They simply surrounded her, guiding her into a chair beneath the golden vanity lights. The process was overwhelming, brushes gliding across her skin, powders settling softly like winter dust, fingers weaving through her hair with expert certainty. Fabrics rustled, zippers whispered, and the room shifted from a bedroom to a studio where Mira became their unfinished masterpiece. When they finished, she had to blink several times to accept the face she saw in the mirror. Her hair fell in smooth waves, framing cheekbones she never knew she had. Her eyes looked larger, sharper, almost luminous under the careful touch of shadow and liner. And the dress, dark emerald satin, hugging and flowing in perfect balance, made her look like she belonged in a world she had only ever served food to. She wasn't Mira Lane, the exhausted waitress. She wasn't even Mira Costello, the temporary wife. She was someone else, someone powerful, unshaken, untouchable. And when Adrian walked in, even he, who rarely showed surprise, stopped. He didn't speak. His silence was stronger than any praise. His gaze held something Mira couldn't decipher. Approval, shock, maybe even a flicker of something dangerously close to admiration. But he turned away before she could read him too much. It didn't matter. They had a dinner to survive. The dining hall looked even grander at night. Crystal chandeliers glowed like molten gold, reflecting off silver place settings arranged with military precision. A long mahogany table stretched across the room like a throne extended horizontally, and at its center, seats were reserved for Adrian and Mira, the couple the entire family had come to evaluate. The moment they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted, conversations quieted, eyes turned, judgment began. Mira could feel it, the weight of every stare crawling across her skin. It was sharp, probing, dissecting her like she was a foreign object placed among priceless antiques. She walked with the grace she had practiced in the car, but her pulse thudded in her ears. She tried to remember everything Adrian told her. Stay close, stay calm, stay controlled. But advice doesn't stop fear. She took her seat beside him, hands resting in her lap, ring catching the chandelier light like a silent declaration. And then the questions came. Not directly, not aggressively, but through glances, smirks, whispered comparisons. People like the Costello family didn't interrogate openly. They probed with etiquette, slicing with politeness sharp enough to cut. And no one cut deeper than Aunt Sophie. Sophie Costello was the kind of woman who wore pearls like armor. Her smile was smooth, charming, deceptively sweet, until she turned her attention toward Mira. Her eyes ran over the dress, the ring, the posture, and stopped at the details that betrayed Mira's past. Hands too delicate but marked from work. Shoulders that tensed when attention grew too sharp. A quietness that didn't match women raised in wealth. Sophie leaned back, letting out a soft breath that sounded like disappointment wrapped in silk. Her comments were subtle at first, little reminders of Mira's humble origins, as she called them. A remark about how refreshing it must be for Adrian to choose someone so unacquainted with luxury. A light laugh at how quickly Mira had adjusted to wearing real diamonds. Each sentence was a polite weapon, and each one made Mira shrink a little inside. But Adrian didn't let her shrink for long. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply placed his hand near Mira's chair, close enough to anchor her without touching, and spoke with a cold certainty that turned the entire table quiet. His defense wasn't loud or dramatic. It was precise, sharp, delivered the way powerful men carve boundaries that others dare not cross. He didn't speak of Mira's beauty or grace. He spoke of her strength, her dignity, her resilience, qualities that couldn't be bought, traded, or forged in wealth. And when he finished, even Aunt Sophie didn't have another word. But the silence didn't bring peace. It brought something worse. Because Luca Costello had arrived. Luca moved differently than his brother. Where Adrian was controlled steel, Luca was silk, smooth, charming, and dangerous in a way that made every instinct flare. His smile curved like he enjoyed secrets. His footsteps were too soft. His gaze lingered too long on people he wanted to unsettle. And tonight, that gaze locked onto Mira. He approached the table with a confidence that filled the room. He greeted family members with practiced warmth, but his eyes kept drifting to her, as if assessing a new toy. A new challenge. When he finally reached her, he extended his hand. And when Mira placed hers into his out of obligation, he held it too long, much too long. His fingers slid against hers in a way that made her stomach tighten. Not with attraction, never that, but with danger, with warning. The kind of slick, subtle threat that told her Luca had already decided she was vulnerable. But before she could pull back, the air beside her hardened. Adrian hadn't moved his chair, hadn't risen, hadn't spoken, but the tension rolling off him was unmistakable, like a storm brewing in perfect silence. A single look from Adrian was enough to freeze Luca's smile. Not erase it. Luca wasn't the type to retreat, but cool it, challenge it, shift it. Two brothers bound by blood and rivalry. Two predators circling the same threat. And Mira? She was the spark. She withdrew her hand slowly, the pulse in her wrist still racing. She could feel Adrian watching her from the corner of his eye, his expression unreadable, but his attention razor sharp. Dinner continued, but the tone of the room had changed. The whispers grew softer, the curiosity sharper, the power dynamics more volatile. Mira felt it. felt the danger she had stepped into, felt the invisible war between the two brothers crackling like electricity. This was no ordinary dinner. This was an evaluation, a test, a warning. And as the final course was served and glasses clinked around her, Mira Lane understood something she hadn't seen clearly before. Adrian Costello didn't just bring her here to pretend to be his wife. He brought her into a battlefield disguised as a family. And the first shots had already been fired. The first night at the Costello estate had already tested Mira more than she expected. But it was the morning after, the quiet hours between sunrise and suspicion, when the real danger began to reveal itself. The house looked peaceful in the early light. Snow softened the edges of the vast gardens, and the marble floors reflected pale gold from the chandeliers overhead. It should have felt calm. It should have felt safe. But the Costello estate was never what it appeared to be, and Serena Costello understood that better than anyone. Mira found her near one of the arched corridors, sipping dark coffee as though she'd been waiting for her. Serena wasn't unfriendly, but her stare was sharper than the frost outside. She studied Mira with a thoughtful intensity, one that held neither hostility nor warmth, only analysis. When Serena finally spoke, her voice was light, but her warning was not. She told Mira that Adrian had never defended anyone the way he defended her at dinner. Not publicly, not forcefully, not even for members of the family he actually cared about. That kind of reaction, Serena said, could draw attention, the wrong kind, especially from Luca. Mira felt her stomach drop at the mention of his name. There was something about the younger Costello brother, something deceptively smooth beneath his charm, that had unsettled her ever since he held her hand too long the night before. Serena noticed that too. She noticed everything. Her final warning lingered long after she walked away. Luca didn't like losing, and last night, Adrian had won. The weight of those words followed Mira as she stepped outside for fresh air. She needed a moment, just one, to breathe, to steady herself, to remember why she was here at all. The icy wind cooled her cheeks and cleared her head, but it didn't erase the feeling creeping between her ribs. Someone was watching her. When she turned, Luca was leaning casually in the doorway, not smiling but almost amused, like a cat who'd found a bird with a broken wing. He approached slowly without making a sound, giving her no room to retreat without revealing fear. He spoke gently, too gently for the cold edge beneath his tone. He asked if she was overwhelmed, asked if she needed help navigating the family, asked in a way that implied he already knew she did. Then, as if offering kindness, he suggested they talk somewhere private. Just a moment, just a conversation, just clarity. Something in his voice felt wrong. Something in her instincts screamed no. But in the Costello household, refusing a member of the family could look suspicious. So against every instinct she had, Mira followed him down the hall. The moment she stepped into the study, she realized her mistake. Luca closed the door behind them with a soft click that echoed far louder in her chest. The room felt smaller than it was, bookshelves crowding in, dark wood swallowing the morning light. And Luca positioned himself between her and the exit with practiced ease. He told her the truth, or rather, the truth he believed, that the story she and Adrian crafted was pretty, but fragile, that Mira didn't behave like someone in love, that she didn't walk like a Costello wife, that women who joined this family usually came with ambition and pedigree, not trembling hands and a past stitched together with survival. He stepped closer, too close. His fingers brushed her necklace as though inspecting it. Not affectionate, assessing, calculating, testing how far he could push. He didn't touch her skin, but the threat hung in the air between his fingertips. Mira tried to hold her ground, but her breath hitched. Luca's smile grew sharper, feeding off the fear he triggered. He asked whether she married Adrian for money, because that would make sense. But love was the part he didn't buy. His hand drifted from her necklace to the curve of her shoulder, tracing the fabric of her dress. The gesture was deliberate, an assertion of dominance disguised as curiosity. Mira froze. This wasn't a conversation anymore. This was a test, a trap, a challenge to the story she had been forced to memorize. And Luca wasn't just trying to intimidate her, he was trying to break her. But the moment he leaned closer, too close, violating a boundary she didn't know how to defend, a sound thundered through the room like the crack of a gunshot. The door slammed open. Adrian didn't walk in. He stormed in. The air changed instantly, thickening with a danger far more real than Luca's predatory charm. Adrian's eyes were locked on his brother, and there was nothing restrained about the rage burning behind them. The next seconds happened too fast for Mira to react. Adrian grabbed Luca by the collar and drove him back against the bookshelves hard enough to rattle the glass. The crack of impact echoed through the study. For a heartbeat, the world fell silent, frozen between two brothers carved from the same blood, but shaped by very different darkness. Luca recovered with a bitter laugh, but Adrian wasn't interested in banter. His fury was cold, precise, and deadly, the kind that should terrify anyone with sense. But Luca lacked that sense. He provoked, smirked, pushed back, and Adrian snapped. He didn't throw wild punches. He didn't scream. He struck with controlled violence. Someone trained, someone who'd spent a lifetime bearing anger until it could be unleashed like a blade. The fight was brutal, fast, and brutally one-sided. The crash of a broken vase, the thud of Luca hitting the floor, the shouts of family members rushing in. By the time Don Silvio entered, the room was a storm's aftermath. His command cut through the chaos like a verdict. He ordered Luca away, away from Mira, away from Adrian, away from any situation where his jealousy could ignite something worse. The patriarch's word was law. Luca obeyed, barely spitting one last poisonous glance in Mira's direction before guards dragged him out. But the story didn't end there. That night, long after the house quieted, Mira sat on the edge of her bed with her heart still pounding from the confrontation. She didn't expect Adrian to knock. She didn't expect him to look shaken. Not angry, not hardened, but shaken. He crossed the room, knelt in front of her, and wrapped his arms around her without saying a single word. Because fear speaks louder when shared in silence. Mira didn't know who he was trying to protect, her or himself, but as he held her, she realized something terrifyingly simple. For Adrian Costello, this wasn't acting anymore, and for the first time since she entered the estate, she wondered whether she was pretending either. Christmas morning at the Costello estate didn't feel like Christmas at all. Not the kind Mira Lane remembered from childhood, where warmth filled tiny living rooms and love made up for the cheap decorations. Here, everything was louder, grander, colder, beauty without heart, tradition without tenderness. The 5-meter Christmas tree rose from the marble floor like a monument, drenched in gold ornaments, crystal icicles, and lights perfectly wrapped by professionals. Beneath it, gifts were piled high enough to build a small fortress, each one wrapped in satin ribbon and embossed with the Costello crest. It should have been magical. But magic doesn't exist in a house built on power. The family gathered around the tree in designer winter clothes, laughing too loudly, smiling too perfectly. It wasn't joy Mira saw, it was calculation. Aunts exchanged glances, brimming with rivalry. Uncles whispered about assets and alliances instead of traditions. Even the cousins tried too hard, measuring one another's gifts the way wolves size up prey. Warmth was a performance here. Affection was strategy, and Mira was the outsider everyone had come to inspect. Still, she stood beside Adrian, playing her part as best she could. The emerald dress from last night had been replaced by a soft ivory sweater dress that matched the faux innocence of the holiday scene. Her hair fell gently over her shoulders. The ring on her finger gleamed like a spotlight. Everyone noticed the ring, especially the relatives who couldn't understand why Adrian, the most controlled, least sentimental Costello, would give such an heirloom to a woman like her. The first gift was handed out by Don Silvio, the patriarch himself. After that, tradition dictated that couples exchange presents in front of the entire family. It was a ritual designed not for joy, but for judgment, a chance for the others to analyze the intimacy of the pair. And Adrian knew that. When it was their turn, he stepped slightly closer to Mira, not touching, not announcing anything, but claiming the space around her as his. Then he handed her a box, small, heavy, wrapped in black ribbon. Every eye in the room sharpened. Mira opened it slowly, feeling the weight before she even lifted the lid. When she saw what was inside, the sound around her faded into a distant blur. A book, not just any book, the rare, battered, beloved first edition novel she had once owned, the one her father had given her, the one she sold to pay part of his hospital bill, convincing herself that sentiment had no place in survival. She had cried the night she let it go. She had never forgiven herself, and now it was back in her hands. Adrian didn't explain how he found it. He didn't boast about the price he paid or the connections he used. He simply watched her reaction, reading every tremble of her fingers, every breath caught in her throat. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't an act. This was something else, something that unsettled her more than all the dangers she'd faced so far. The room watched like predators scenting blood, hungry for flaws, hungry for cracks. But Mira's emotions were too real to fake, and that authenticity only deepened the mystery in their eyes. Why her? Why this girl? Why did Adrian look at her like that? To steady herself, Mira reached for the gift she'd prepared for him. Not grand, not expensive, just meaningful. A vintage fountain pen she found days earlier, identical to the one Adrian's father once owned. She remembered the story he told her in the car, his father signing documents with that pen, pressing it into the wood when he was angry, tapping it when deep in thought. Adrian took the pen as though it were priceless. For a moment, the entire estate went quiet. Not the respectful quiet of admiration, the tense quiet of realization. Something was happening between them, something they couldn't categorize, something they couldn't control. But not everyone was pleased. From the opposite side of the room, Luca Costello leaned against a marble pillar, swirling a glass of amber liquor in slow circles. His smirk never faded. The warmth around the tree didn't reach his eyes. He watched Mira with the same subtle malice he had shown in the study, the kind that disguised danger beneath casual charm. He finally stepped forward, just close enough for his voice to carry. His words were coated in sugar, but sharpened with poison. He praised Mira's impressive ability to adapt, as though survival were a trick. He admired her resourcefulness, making it sound like manipulation. He complimented her choice in gifts, twisting it into a suggestion that she was trying to win Adrian's favor cheaply. Every sentence was a blade dipped in velvet. Mira tried to remain composed, but Luca's tone was too deliberate to ignore. It wasn't teasing, it was targeted, and every member of the family sensed it. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, the air thinned with anticipation. Luca kept circling verbally, his jabs growing more pointed, hinting that women from humble beginnings often had strong motivations, that the Costello name attracted opportunists, that Mira might have come into Adrian's life conveniently close to the Council of Heirs. The insinuation hung in the room like smoke. And that's when Mira felt it, Adrian's presence hardening beside her. He didn't speak immediately, didn't leap to anger the way Luca wanted. Instead, he remained still, so still that the tension radiating off him became something physical. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop. Everyone in the family recognized the signs. Adrian Costello rarely lost control, but when he did, there were consequences. He didn't lash out, not yet. He didn't defend Mira with grand declarations, not in front of these people. He simply stared at Luca with a look sharp enough to slice through bone. A warning, a threat, a promise. And Luca, spoiled, reckless, perpetually taunting, smiled back, acknowledging the danger like a man greeting an old friend. Mira realized then that this wasn't just tension. This was a rivalry older than she understood, a battle simmering beneath the surface long before she arrived. She didn't cause it, but she had become its spark. The holiday laughter resumed, fragile and forced. The tree glittered. The gifts lay open on laps and tables. But beneath the festive glow, something cold had taken root. It was the beginning of a fracture, the first break in the illusion of family unity, the moment when Mira stopped being an outsider and became a threat. Night fell over the Costello estate like a warning, quiet, heavy, and deceptively calm. Snow blanketed the gardens outside, muffling the world in a white stillness. But peace rarely lasted long in a family like this, especially when Luca Costello wasn't done stirring the fire. The Christmas celebration had ended hours ago. Guests had drifted back to their rooms, lights dimmed, and the hallways emptied into uneasy silence. But Mira couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching her. Every corner she passed, every shadow she crossed, seemed to follow her with eyes she couldn't see. Adrian sensed it too. Throughout the evening, his posture remained tense, as if expecting a threat to step out at any moment. The storm between the two brothers was far from over. Luca had no intention of letting the earlier tension die quietly, and he didn't. It happened in the conference room, a place that looked more like a battleground of business than a space for family. Long oak table, towering windows, expensive art on the walls, and a silence that carried danger beneath it. Mira had stepped inside only to leave a gift bag, something one of the house staff asked her to return. She didn't expect anyone would be there, but Luca was. He stood at the far end of the room, swirling a drink the color of embers. His smile flickered in the low light, smooth and poisonous. And when he spoke, it wasn't to greet her, it was to strike. He told her she had played her part well, too well. That Adrian didn't defend people, he used them. That a girl with her past couldn't possibly have earned a Costello heirloom on her finger. That she must have done something clever, something manipulative, to ensnare Adrian. And then, the phrase that changed everything. She was a trap, a nobody who had learned to weaponize vulnerability. Mira stepped back instinctively, but Luca followed, circling her like a man drawn to the scent of fear. His words dripped with accusation and twisted admiration. He spun theories about her motives, her background, her convenient arrival in Adrian's life. He made it sound like she was the mastermind of something dark, something calculated. But beneath his poison, there was something else. Jealousy. Not jealousy of Mira herself, but jealousy of the way Adrian looked at her. Of the way Adrian defended her. Of the way Mira had triggered something in his older brother that Luca had never managed to provoke. And Luca hated it. The more he spoke, the more vicious his tone became. He stepped closer, invading her space, trying to force a confession she couldn't give because there was nothing to confess. Mira's breath grew shallow. Her back hit the edge of the table. But what happened next was not planned. Not by her, not by him, not by anyone. Because Adrian arrived. He didn't shout. He didn't warn. He didn't even ask what was happening. He saw Luca looming over Mira. An instinct took over. Adrian crossed the room faster than she could blink. His fist connected with Luca's jaw with a force that cracked the silence apart. The sound echoed through the glass, through the wood, through Mira's bones. Luca staggered back, stunned but far from defeated. He wiped the blood at the corner of his mouth and laughed, a low, taunting sound that fueled Adrian's rage. The brothers collided in a brutal clash. No structure, no restraint, no pretense of civility. This wasn't a family disagreement. This was a lifetime of rivalry erupting in a single explosion. Adrian's second punch sent Luca crashing into the glass panel beside the shelves. The impact was so violent the glass shattered, raining jagged fragments like falling ice. A portrait on the wall tilted crooked. Mira screamed his name, but her voice drowned under the chaos. Guards rushed in, aunts shouted, cousins pulled back furniture. The entire house erupted like a hive struck with a stone. Half the room sided with Luca, shouting that Adrian had lost control, that he'd crossed a line. The other half defended Adrian, claiming he'd acted to protect his wife, his dignity, his household. It wasn't just a fight, it was a divide. The Costello family split into two factions right there in front of Mira. Fury on both sides, pride wounded, egos ignited. Through the chaos, Don Silvio arrived. The patriarch didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He simply stood in the doorway, and the entire room froze like statues. With a single gesture, he ordered Luca removed from the hall. Not punished, not forgiven, just removed. Banished from proximity to Mira, forbidden from speaking to her again, forbidden from approaching her without Adrian present. Luca wanted to argue, but one look from Don Silvio silenced him. Guards dragged him away, leaving a trail of blood drops across the polished floor. The door slammed. Silence swallowed the room. And then, the house breathed again. The family dispersed slowly, whispering to each other, eyes flickering with newfound suspicion. The perfect Costello facade had cracked, and Mira had become the fracture line. When the last of them left, Mira finally turned to Adrian. He stood barefoot among glass shards, knuckles bloodied, chest heaving with the remnants of rage he hadn't fully released. For a man known for control, he looked dangerously close to unraveling. He took one step toward her, just one, and something in him broke. He pulled her into his arms, not like a husband trying to perform, not like a man protecting property, but like someone who had almost lost something he didn't know he needed until it was almost taken from him. His grip was strong, desperate, trembling in a way she'd never felt from him before. Mira felt his heart beat against hers, erratic, real, unguarded. And in that moment, she forgot the room, the family, the contract. She forgot the danger, the politics, the lies they rehearsed. She felt only him. And when she whispered that she didn't want this to last just 7 days, something shifted between them, because the way Adrian kissed her then, slow, deep, undeniably real, was nothing like an act. It was a confession made without words, a confession that terrified them both. In a house built on secrets, silence could be more dangerous than shouting. And that night, after the violent clash between Adrian and Luca, the Costello estate fell into a silence so heavy it felt alive, pressing against the windows, clinging to the walls, drifting like shadowed breath through every corridor. Mira couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the room she was supposed to share with Adrian, though he had stepped away for air after holding her in the aftermath of the chaos. The echo of his arms around her still lingered, strong, unguarded, trembling in a way she never thought possible from a man like him. She should have been afraid. She should have been planning her escape. Instead, she felt something far more dangerous, something tender, something terrifying. Somewhere near midnight, a soft knock broke the stillness. When the door opened, it wasn't Adrian. It was Don Silvio. The patriarch of the Castello Empire didn't enter like an old man visiting a guest. He entered like a ruler stepping into a courtroom, judging the heir before he judged the person. His cane tapped once against the marble floor, a sound that carried more authority than the voices of every family member combined. Mira rose instinctively, unsure if she should bow, speak, or simply disappear. But the Don raised a hand, not to silence her, but to soften her, and that alone frightened her more than any threat. He studied her with eyes that had seen decades of power struggles, betrayals, and victories that cost more than gold. Eyes that missed nothing. Eyes that had watched Adrian grow from a stoic, guarded boy into a man who carried silence the way others carried scars. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't the booming authority she had heard before. It was quiet, rasped at the edges, but steady, clear, undeniable. He knew everything, not suspicion, not rumor, the truth, the contract, the deal, the lies woven to convince the family. The arrangement Mira had signed out of desperation, not devotion. He repeated the facts with the calm of someone reviewing evidence. Every piece, every detail, each word felt like it pulled the rug from beneath her feet. Mira expected anger, condemnation, the cold fury of a man whose dynasty had been manipulated. But that's not what she received. Instead, Don Silvio spoke the words Mira least expected and feared the most. He said Adrian had fallen in love with her. Not infatuation, not convenience, not performance. Love. Real love. The kind that terrified powerful men because it made them vulnerable in ways bullets could not. The Don didn't say it with sentiment. He said it with clarity, as though explaining a shift in strategy the family needed to prepare for. He spoke of Adrian's eyes, the way they followed her, the way his fists flew the instant she was threatened. He spoke of the risk Adrian had taken, publicly, violently, to protect her from Luca. And then he said something heavier still. Adrian feared losing her more than he feared losing his position, his influence, or the inheritance the council was meant to decide. For a man raised in the Castello world, that kind of fear was unimaginable, unacceptable, unconquerable. The Don went quiet, letting the truth sink into her bones. And that's when Mira understood the real reason he was there. Tonight wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about exposure. It wasn't even about the contract. It was about choice. Don Silvio stepped closer, the soft thump of his cane marking each inch of the distance between them until he stood close enough for her to smell the faint hint of cedar smoke in his coat. He laid out two paths. The first path was the clean one. She could walk away from the estate tonight. No one would stop her. No one would touch her. She would leave with enough money to build a life far from the Castello shadows, enough to pay debts, rebuild, breathe freely. She would vanish from their world, and they would protect her disappearance. Her name would never be tied to Adrian again. She would be safe, and alone. The second path was the one that made her pulse stutter. She could walk downstairs to the old library where Adrian was waiting, not as a husband in a contract, not as a man playing a role, but as someone standing on the edge of hope and fear, waiting for her answer. If she walked into that library, she wouldn't be stepping into a fairy tale. She would be stepping into a world where love was a liability, where loyalty was demanded at knife point, where her presence could ignite wars she didn't know existed. A life with Adrian would never be simple, never be quiet, never be safe. It would be messy or painful, or beautiful in ways she didn't yet understand. It would require strength she wasn't sure she had, but it would be real. The Don didn't tell her which choice was right. He didn't push. He didn't threaten. He simply said the decision had to be hers. Then he left the room as silently as he came, leaving Mira standing in the dim light, breath trembling, heart splitting between fear and longing. When the door clicked shut behind him, Mira sank onto the edge of the bed, reality pressing against her with crushing force. She understood now what Adrian had risked, what he had almost lost. She remembered the way he held her after the fight, the way his arms trembled, the way his breath hitched when he whispered that he couldn't lose her, the way he kissed her, raw, unfiltered, honest. There had been no performance in that kiss. Her fingers trembled as she touched her lips. 7 days. It was supposed to be just 7 days. But somewhere between the lies she rehearsed and the truths she never meant to reveal, her heart had made a decision long before her mind did. And now, she had to choose whether to follow it. With a deep, unsteady breath, Mira stood up. She walked toward the door, toward the hallway glowing faintly under old chandeliers, toward the staircase leading down, toward the library, and the man waiting inside it, suspended between hope and heartbreak. Tonight, she would decide not only his future, but hers. Some moments in life don't arrive with fireworks. They arrive in silence, breathing softly at the edges of fear and hope. That was the silence that followed Mira Lane as she descended the grand staircase of the Costello estate and walked toward the old library. Every step echoed like a decision. Every breath carried the weight of two futures. Behind her lay safety. Ahead of her waited danger, and something far more frightening, the truth of her own heart. The hallway leading to the library was dim, lit only by wall sconces shaped like wrought iron torches. Shadows swayed with her movements, stretching across velvet carpets like dark hands reaching for her ankles. But Mira didn't slow. Her pulse raced, but her feet never hesitated, because Adrian was waiting. She could feel it long before she saw him. The door to the library was slightly ajar, a spill of warm amber light cutting into the hall like a promise. She pushed it open gently, the old hinges groaning as though they sensed the magnitude of her choice. And there he was. Adrian Costello stood with his back to her, framed by towering shelves of leather-bound books. His posture, normally straight, composed, unreadable, was broken tonight. His shoulders were tense, his head bowed, his hands clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles were white. He hadn't heard her enter, or maybe he had, and he was too afraid to turn around. Afraid that if he looked at the doorway and didn't see her, something inside him would break in a way no physical fight ever could. For a man like Adrian, raised to control every emotion, every decision, every weakness, fear was an unfamiliar, unwelcome companion. But tonight, fear owned him. Mira took a single breath, steadying, grounding, and stepped fully into the room. Her voice came out soft but unwavering. She said she chose him. The words were simple, but they struck Adrian harder than any punch he'd thrown in the last 2 days. He turned then, slowly, almost painfully, as if bracing for a ghost. And when he saw her, something inside him collapsed. His chest rose sharply, a breath stolen by relief so raw it bordered on agony. His eyes, cold steel softened by vulnerability, locked onto hers, searching, disbelieving, desperate to trust what he heard. No act, no performance, no contract forcing her hand. Just choice, her choice. In a family where loyalty was bought with blood and fear, a woman choosing him freely was the rarest treasure of all. He stepped closer, not with the confidence of the Costello heir, but with the uncertainty of a man terrified of mishandling something precious. His hand hovered near hers but didn't touch, as though giving her one final chance to pull away. She didn't, and with that permission, a permission spoken in silence, Adrian finally let go of the walls he had carried all his life. His confession didn't come in words. It came in the way he cupped her face gently, almost reverently, like he was afraid she would break. It came in the tremor of his breath as his forehead touched hers. It came in the quiet, unguarded way he let himself be human. No title, no legacy, no iron mask. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, roughened by emotion he usually buried deep. He asked her to marry him, not for the family, not for the council of heirs, not for tradition or appearances, but for them, for the life he wanted to build with her, for the future he didn't dare imagine until she walked back into the room. He told her he couldn't promise a safe world. The Costello name came with danger woven into its bloodline. Shadows followed their family everywhere, shadows that didn't care about love or vows. But he could promise something else, that he would fight for her, stand with her, and never let her face the darkness alone. It wasn't a grand speech. Adrian wasn't a poetic man, but every word carried truth weightier than gold. Mira's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming surge of clarity washing over her. She had spent years surviving alone, years bearing her dreams under debt and grief, years believing she wasn't meant for anything beyond struggle. Yet here she was, chosen by a man who had built his life around walls no one was allowed to enter. And for the first time in a long time, she believed she deserved to be loved. She whispered yes, not timid, not uncertain, but with a conviction that reached into her marrow. Adrian exhaled like a man pulled from drowning. He didn't kiss her like he had during their argument in the conference room, fierce, desperate, laced with adrenaline. This kiss was different, slow, intentional, steady, the kind that didn't demand anything but offered everything. It wasn't a claim. It wasn't possession. It was a vow that bound them more tightly than any contract ever could. For Mira, the moment felt unreal. Only days ago, she was a waitress counting tips to survive, a girl whose life felt too small to matter. And now she was standing in a library dripping with history, being held by a man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders, yet looked at her like she was the one thing he couldn't live without. He rested his forehead against hers again, both of them breathing the same shaking breath, letting the reality of their decisions settle around them. Two people who shouldn't have crossed paths, two souls from worlds that never touched, yet somehow in the chaos, in the danger, in the lies they were forced to tell, they had found something real, something worth choosing, something worth fighting for. When Mira opened her eyes, she saw the future staring back at her. Not the future she had been running from, but the one she was walking toward. The life of a Costello wife wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be gentle, but it would be theirs. And for the first time in 7 days, she wasn't pretending. She was home.